West London. The part of London where Central C's story begins seems like an unusual place for a drill rapper, because according to the statistics, this isn't just the richest area in London or the UK, but the entire of Europe. Much of West London's wealth can be explained by the fact that it was the area where the city's centre of power was originally formed. The west of the city includes the Palace of Westminster, the home of the Parliament of the UK, the Royal Church of Westminster Abbey, where the British royalties have their coronations, weddings and funerals, and Buckingham Palace, home of Britain's kings and queens. There's also the infamously referred to district of the West End of London, which early on became the favourite location of London's upper classes due to its closeness to the city's centre of power, and it's now the heart of London's commercial and entertainment scene, with famous tourist places located in the West End of London like Piccadilly Circus, which is like our Times Square, Trafalgar Square, the shops on Oxford Street, which I guess is like Fifth Avenue, the world-renowned theatres on Shaftesbury Avenue, the Apple Market and Royal Opera House of the Covent Garden. You've got all the fancy restaurants and nightclubs in Soho. Technically, the places I've just mentioned are more commonly being considered as part of central London. The most poppin' stuff in London goes on in central, and perhaps that's why he's called Central C. But as London grew, the affluence from these areas spread further west to the residential neighbourhoods that are now some of the wealthiest in the world, such as Chelsea, Knightsbridge and Kensington. Or if we look at the postcodes, we can see that practically all of the most expensive postcodes in the city are in West London. It would then be easy to think that there must be no gangs in West London, unless it's a Freemason gang started by some young trust fund drillers named Oliver, Archibald and Alfred. However, as I discussed in my video about the popular UK drill rapper and aspiring serial killer Suspect from Active Gang in Camden, London is one of those places where the mega rich and powerful can live in their £1,000,000 mansions and still be just a stone's throw away from some of the poorest and most dangerous hoods in the city. And nowhere is this contrast arguably more extreme than in West London, where the star of our current story hails from. This of course differs from many of the American cities that I usually talk about, places like Chicago, where the poor south side and west sides are rather neatly separated from the wealthy north side of the city. Now there's many reasons why these differences exist between the UK and US cities, like the huge difference in the ages of the cities in Europe and America and how that's affected their development. You could also point to the unique history of slavery in the States, Jim Crow laws and segregation in America, as well as the differences in zoning laws and the popularity of socialist ideals in Europe compared to the US, just to name a few things. But the main point for the sake of this video is that London is relatively dense in public housing, or what's increasingly known as social housing or council flats. Emphasis on relatively, as it should also be mentioned that London does have a severe housing crisis, with many arguing that the city needs much more public and social housing, as hundreds of thousands of people are still currently on waiting lists with not enough social housing to go around. But in any case, the more traditional public housing in the UK, typically known as council estates, are usually made of several multi-storey buildings that form large housing complexes, not much different from the project buildings in American cities like New York. And these blocks are found all over the city. For example, in the highly affluent Chelsea area has an ominously named council estate called the World's End Estate, where people live practically across the street from some of the richest people in London, like the former owner of the Chelsea football team, Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. People in the much poorer estate, on the way to their state-funded property, have to walk right past the luxury shops that are selling £15,000 gold-dusted mirrors. However, the key areas for this story are even further west, including the suburb of Shepherd's Bush, where Central C grew up, and another area known as Ladbroke Grove, where Central's biggest rival Digger D hails from. This area technically being within the district of Notting Hill, which is known of course from the famous film of the same name, although the rappers from the area predictably don't seem to identify with this upmarket neighbourhood. Directly up north from Notting Hill, there's also the infamous Mozart estate, located in West Kilburn, where another top UK drill rapper Fredo also hails from. In these areas further west, the income inequality between the haves and have-nots becomes slightly less extreme, and there's generally more council estates than in the more affluent areas closer to central London. But don't get it twisted. This borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, where Shepherd's Bush is located, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, where Ladbroke Grove is located, and the city of Westminster, where the Mozart estate is based, still happen to be some of the most affluent areas in all of London, with average prices being well over £1,000,000, amongst some of the most dangerous estates in the west of the city. Moreover, some of these areas have experienced significant gentrification during the past decades, further contributing to driving away the less well-off, and keeping those have-nots who remain on the estates tightly segregated and isolated. Now, the exact location in Shepherd's Bush where UK drill fans think Central C hails from is the White City estate, or at least he's likely from the larger district of White City, which forms the northern part of Shepherd's Bush. Apparently, this is also where infamous London fashion designer Clint, who founded the brand Cortez, hails from too. Now, Central C is known to rep a particular building in the western edge of the White City district called Burley Tower, showcasing it in several music videos, including the music video for the mega hit Doja. In any case, White City has a particularly interesting history, as the area was originally built for a grandiose 1908 event known as the White City Expedition, which included 200 acres of palaces, halls, stadiums, and canals resembling Venice in appearance. But the actual White City estate's construction began in the late 1930s, and it was hailed at the time as the largest and finest estate of flats house, which the council has yet built. There were also some features rarely seen in council estates, such as the enormous White City Stadium built for the 1908 Summer Olympics, which had a capacity of 93,000 spectators until it was eventually closed and demolished in the mid-80s. Moreover, in 1960, the British public broadcasting company, the BBC, opened its massive television production headquarters right next to the estate.
This is our new headquarters, rising 7 stories high over Wood Lane in London. It's the first BBC building to be designed for television, and it came into operation this summer. The first production came from Studio 3 and was called First Night. This 100-feet-long studio is one of 7 in a building that may well become the Hollywood of television.
And the building remained the BBC television headquarters until 2013. And the BBC eventually also developed the lands of the former stadium, which became known as the BBC Media Village. But nowadays, the former BBC television headquarters are a mix of luxury residential apartments, offices, and retail spaces, including the incredibly bougie members club White City House. But while the former BBC Media Village is now an equally luxurious creative campus for offices, retail, and event spaces, moreover, in 2008, a huge Westfield shopping mall was opened near the estate too, which was further expanded in 2018, making it the largest shopping centre in Europe. Culturally, Shepherd's Bush has a whole lot going on. And yet, amongst this apparent wealth, prosperity, and gentrification, White City still has a large working class population living in the council estates and other social housing, the majority of whom are ethnic minorities and immigrants, the largest group being black people of Caribbean or African heritage. In fact, the average household income in White City is amongst the lowest in the borough. An article in the Police Oracle in June 2024 gives us a clearer picture of the area, detailing retired police officer Chris Hobbs' experience walking along his previous local beat in the West London streets of Shepherd's Bush, where he explained that parts of the area that used to be a vibrant shopping thoroughfare have now been transformed into a scene that reminds him of the Great Depression, the primary issue being crime fueled by drug dealers, addicts, and street drinkers who commit offences without facing any consequences. But what's wild is that even during the former officer's walk through his patrol area is that he would witness 3 crimes, including harassment, stealing, and shoplifting. And while recording the escape of a shoplifter on his phone from the final incident, he would even be confronted by another perpetrator who threatened him if he didn't stop. So it's easy to see that no matter how rich the West End of London appears to be, there are still enclaves of poverty and segregation, particularly within many council estates. And it's within these enclaves of poverty and segregation that also gangs have existed for a long time. For example, in the early 90s, when crack was becoming a hot button issue in the UK, there were so-called yardie gangs of Caribbean origin operating in West London too. And in the late 90s, after many refugees had arrived from the former Yugoslavia, a Serbian gang was causing concerns in Notting Hill with drug dealing, extortion, and racketeering. Later on in 2007, a gang intelligence document by Scotland Yard's Special Crime Directorate was leaked, which at the time suggested there was 257 gangs in London, 18 of them operating in West, with gangs like Westbourne Park Mandem, Ladbroke Grove Mandem, Latimer Road Mandem, the Edward Woods Boys, the Bush Mandem, and the Becklow Mandem, likely being from around the Shepherd's Bush and Notting Hill areas based on their names alone. A particularly large gang from West London appeared at the time, going by the name MDP, or Money Drugs Power, or Merc, or Murdered MP. This gang seemingly operated in numerous areas of the town like Acton, the districts of Ealing and West Ealing, and also Shepherd's Bush, as one former member would tell the Evening Standard newspaper in 2012. In fact, in 2007, 5 teenage members of the MDP, 3 of them from Shepherd's Bush, would fatally attack a 16-year-old by the name of Kojo Yenga with knives and baseball bats in Hammersmith Grove near Shepherd's Bush, while a group of girls would cheer them on. Friends of Kojo would later tell a newspaper how he might have been killed as part of an initiation ritual to the gang, claiming that MDP only allowed in members who had stabbed somebody. 2 of the boys would eventually end up getting 15 years for murder, while the rest would get 10 years for manslaughter. That same year, the Acton branch of the same gang would carry out an identical deadly attack on a 22-year-old university student, Yusim Abdirahman, with some of the culprits reportedly also belonging to a gang called FDA, or F the Authorities, with both MDP and FDA members also participating in the so-called road rap phenomenon at the time, dropping early UK versions of gangster rap before drill became a thing.
I'm one of them brazen road that won't pet to cop back the strap and bust it. Rude boy, come off the petting ting, stop stalling, stop cussing. I'm from West, but I ain't no cowboy. Seeing my boys start banging off loud.
But because of the increasing youth violence in London, in 2007, the London Metropolitan Police, aka the Met, would begin keeping a special database of all of the teenage killing victims. And the following year, they would also tell the media about their own gang statistics, stating that they were aware of only 171 gangs operating in the city, one of these being a West London gang called the SD Crew, which was not mentioned on Scotland Yard's list, with all of this likely pointing to the fact that most youth street gangs in London were were very loose in formation and started and ended in a pretty fast phase. However, surprisingly, still in 2018, during a particularly deadly year in the London gang wars, news would report how notorious leaders of the MDP had been arrested in numerous raids following a murder spree, with the police discovering numerous guns and drugs, including a Scorpion submachine gun and 2 kilograms of crack. This particular gang then seemingly having been active in West London for over a decade.
There is an update on another address which has been searched, or is currently being searched at the moment. Initial inspection, they look like they found what appears to be a Scorpion submachine gun, a handgun, and a large quantity of Class A drugs.
But coming into the 2010s, the gang problem would continue to be highlighted by the media, with one 2013 article noting how 124 youths had been killed since 2007 when the Met actually begun keeping their database. 2/3 of the victims having been killed by stabbing and 1/5 by shooting, whilst almost 40% of the killings had been flagged as officially gang-related. The article would also mention that parts of West London were the only exception where there wasn't a gang problem, these likely being the areas closest to the central. But during the very early 2010s, there were also some road rappers trying to make their way in Shepherd's Bush, with very stereotypically British-sounding artist names, such as Don Tantrum, Dirts, Hollow Slugs, and Ryder Tiggs, but it doesn't seem that any of these artists were really able to break through with the music. Meanwhile, the so-called county lines drug trafficking, a hot-button issue of recent years where gangs travel from large cities like London to smaller towns to sell drugs, was already seemingly taking shape by 2013, when a gang from Shepherd's Bush called the Bush Boys would reportedly travel to the town of Basildon to deal crack and heroin to the local residents. Around that same time, a new gang began making noise in Shepherd's Bush itself. This gang was known as OBY, or Original Bush Youngers. OBY would partake in the UK rap scene, which around this time was beginning to also be heavily influenced by Chicago drill, with one particularly active rapper from the gang being known as Bush Boy Ryder, or later Big Boss Ryder.
Any bigger that I see, I ain't ramping on your estate. That's a mad thing. Obi White West Door, that's a mad thing.
Ryder would seemingly drop numerous songs and music videos around the early to mid 2010s, but for whatever reason, most of the earlier songs were seemingly later deleted, although many have been re-uploaded to YouTube. Another early rapper from the gang who would then begin to gain some real traction in the new UK drill scene was Ryder's cousin, Creeps Savage, later known as Sav 12.
Cave, antics come free, leave you in the grave. And just remember that I don't play games and I've never been a stunter, that's not me. You can't come to my blocks with your moist G's. My oldest won't pet to rinse a couple teeth. Let off 3-4 shells at your soft team. Think I'm joking, my oldest got the chrome ting.
Like Ryder, most of Sav's early songs and music videos have seemingly been deleted, but some have since been re-uploaded. Surprisingly though, some youths from Shepherd's Bush were also seemingly cool with a gang from around Ladbroke Grove, which at the time was known as P Block. The P seemingly standing for Portobello Road, or estates like Portobello Court or Powis Court, the latter being Digger D's old stomping grounds. These youths from Shepherd's Bush and Ladbroke Grove would even allegedly have an alliance together called 916, with the name of the alliance possibly coming from dividing the postcode of Ladbroke Grove, which is W11, with the postcode of Shepherd's Bush, which is W12. And as funny as that sounds, some people repping 916 on the music side were rappers like Johnny 5, whose music videos from the mid-2010s would include cameos from a young Digger, R Loud, and K Slav, later known as Loose One, who would do the classic song Drillings on Drillings with Digger D in 2016. However, during the latter part of the 2010s, something would go wrong between Shepherd's Bush and Ladbroke Grove, breaking the friendships and alliances and forming a deep rivalry between the two, after which the Ladbroke Grove gang would become known as 1011, the name this time formed around the postcodes of W10 and W11 around Ladbroke Grove. Sav 12 would later describe to the famous UK music engineer and YouTuber Fumes the Engineer why this breakup happened, implying a generational divide being the main reason.
Where did everything start from? Man heard that everyone was friends.
Yeah.
10, 11, the 12, and all of a sudden, getting splashed, videos on art blocks, and man's just thinking, wow, where did the friends go?
Them youths there, they're like their own batch in their area, you get me? Certain things was happening, not with them, but with other youths from their areas, you get me? And then boom, one time, they was rolling with the Bush youths, they went to one team, one set, one event. Certain man just weren't hearing it, you get me? Like man were trying to vouch for them, saying they're cool, they're not involved in the beef. Certain man were just saying that, like they're not hearing it. So it was kind of like,
so it's basically one person just decided to split the whole,
like
split the sea.
Obviously,
like,
I'm not gonna say like I'm not gonna say everyone was cool.
Yeah.
With them being cool with some of the youngers, because not everyone was. You get me? But he said it. You know what I'm saying? Like
Okay.
1011 would begin to be heavily repped in music by guys like Digga D, Savo, Horrid One, and numerous others, and they would eventually change their name to CGM, an acronym which has several meanings, but one of them likely being Certified Grove Members. The youth from Shepherd's Bush, on the other hand, would eventually begin to rep several different sets known as 12 World or 12 Anti, repped on the music side by guys like Sav 12 and S1, who was getting some major exposure during the late 2010s. However, as we'll discuss later, 12 World would get into some controversy and seemingly stop existing a few years ago, with both rappers seemingly disappearing from the UK drill scene. 12 Anti, on the other hand, would seemingly become active, at least on the music side somewhat later, starting at around 2018, with artists like Little Catty, Box 12, S2 Saucy, and F. Dot, a close friend of Central C's. Some youths from Shepherd's Bush would also seemingly rep the moniker 8712, such as Sav 12's cousin Ryder. But interestingly, in 2018, during the Borough of Fulham and Hammersmith's Committee meeting for Children, Education, Policy and Accountability, the head of Youth Offending Services would give an overview of youth violence in the area, where she would note that a gang called the 87s from the White City estate were the most concerning gang in the area, with this perhaps being a reference to 8712, as well as mentioning that the majority of the violence in this borough came from the gang's rivalry with another gang from Ladbroke Grove, this likely being a reference to 1011. However, the cousins Sav 12 and Ryder would later have a falling out, and the 8712 has seemingly stopped existing since. The only one of these older sets still being active then is 12 Anti, while newer sets have since popped up from the same White City area, such as WCE, with these sets then becoming strongly affiliated with Central C after his blow-up in the UK drill scene around 2020. But 2020 was by no means just the start of Central C's rapping journey, which goes back over a decade at this point. So now that we know a bit about the area that he hails from, let's take a closer look at the man himself, learning about Central's childhood and early experiences in Shepherd's Bush, and eventually his connections, if any, to the West London criminal underworld. Because if C's music is anything to go by, he was knee-deep in the roads of West London, but the reality behind the music is much more dark and complicated.